Hey, hello everyone. Good morning, good evening from wherever you're joining from. I'm Praveen from Bangalore, developer advocate at Hasura. Today, we're going to talk about Next.js and how to integrate like a GraphQL backend with Next.js. We'll be using GraphQL queries, mutations, and subscriptions with the Next.js app. So the stack would be Apollo client for the front-end integration. And obviously, we'll be using Hasura backend for the GraphQL server. We'll be creating some tables and we'll look at how to integrate that with an Apollo client on the front end on Next.js. We'll also go through how is it different for building static sites with Next.js and server-side rendering as well. So we'll look at the data fetching side of Next.js and how easy it is to integrate a GraphQL query inside that, and we look at caching for front-end as well as backend. How you will make use of caching on Hasura Cloud so that the data fetching is pretty fast. And you'll also have a version of caching on the front end with the Apollo client. So that's roughly what we will be talking about today. And for the demo app, I'm just going to start it from scratch. A simple Next.js starter. The sample would be npx. I'm just going to use npx, create next app. I'm just going to give it Hasura Next.js. This is going to set up the dependencies. So once we're done with this, we'll try out a simple query with the fetch API and see how that can be integrated with GraphQL. And then we'll move over to see how things are different with the GraphQL client and what benefits do they offer in addition to just in comparison to what you can do with a simple fetch API. Right. So let me do Hasura Next.js. Let me zoom this up a little bit. All right, pretty simple package structure. Let me do yarn dev. Open another tab. Open VS Code. It's gonna move around some screens. All right, so the app is obviously running on localhost 3000. We can see the sample Next.js starter. Meanwhile, do let me know where you're joining in from on the comments. I'll be happy to hear different regions. Cool. So this is the Next.js demo that they've given for the starter kit. All right, so we have an index.js with all these demo data, and we have like a template for a global component. This is the underscore app where you will inject some code here, and there's a demo API route for Next.js. Cool. So they're all pretty standard stuff with Next.js. So let's move on to the data fetching side with Next.js. We have different ways to do data fetching. We have, depending on the app, obviously, if your app is primarily about static data, you can make use of this get static props for data fetching. This will allow you to build your application at build time. The HTML output will be done at the build time, and then you can deploy it, and then you get like a very fast site that's pre-compiled for you. The other way around is to do server-side rendering, which is when whenever you make a request on the browser and you hit the server, the data gets compiled. Uh, the number of API calls are being made to the database or for whatever data sources that you have. And then the HTML is compiled on the fly and then returned back to the browser. So there are use cases for that. And that's where you will probably make use of server-side rendering and you will make use of get server-side drops. So if you're a Jamstack fan, you will end up using get static props, um, and uh, and and it's not going to restrict you from making dynamic calls on the front end. In both the cases, what you do at the server doesn't really affect what you can do on the client. So the dynamic client part will still be pretty much applicable for you. Cool. We have a couple of folks on the comments. Hi, Con. There's also Carlos, Netherlands and Chile. That's interesting. I don't know what time zones. I think around evening in Netherlands, maybe. Cool. Awesome. So yeah, so for today, the demo would be around Jamstack. I'm going to start building some static apps. Basically use data from my database and then precompile some HTML at build time. And switching between these two would be just switching the function name. It's just get server-side props and get static props. So that's fundamentally it. So I'm going to copy paste this get static props into my app. Let me zoom in this code setup. I'm guessing this is pretty much visible. Right. All right. So this shouldn't come on the app.js. It should come on the index. So let me put this over here. We have like an exported async function for get static props, which has access to the context, and you can return some props to the component. Right. So as a quick check, we can pass in some data, maybe products, which will have like an array of objects. Let's say we pass in ID and the name. Let's say I pass in speaker and say the next one be, okay, let's verify that this object works. So the props that we send over from here would be accessible inside the component, into the page component. We're sending in products, so we can access products inside. Let's do a console log of products to just quickly verify this. Thing is compiled. And I'm just gonna go to network, refresh. We can see that the array of objects are visible over here. So the props are getting passed on correctly. Now this is dummy data, so obviously we need to replace this with data from our backend. And to do that, we will go to Hasura Cloud and we can create a new project with Hasura Cloud and select a region. This could be US. And the project name is Next.js Hasura. New database setup. And for database, I'm going to make use of Heroku. Heroku has a free Postgres add-on that you can use with a little bit of a limitation, but for a quick hobby project, I think it's a great way to get started with. And it's like one-click integration with Hasura. Awesome. So once we have this database connected with with the Next.js Hasura project, we can create up some tables. And once you create up tables, you'll get some APIs automatically generated for you from Hasura. So this is the GraphQL interface, which we will explore later. Let's create a table. Let's say we are creating simple e-commerce setup. I'll have like a products table with a few columns. Let's say ID with an auto incrementing integer, and that would be like a name for the product, and maybe like an image path, and this would also be like a text. And we would have like the frequently used columns. There'll be like a price column as well, which can be like a numeric, can be like a float or an integer. So I'm making use of numeric, and we can use created at and updated at, and the primary key would be ID. Let me zoom this in. Cool. So I'm going to add this table, and you might see the table getting added, but let's go to GraphQL and start inserting some data. So once we create the table, we will have the GraphQL schema auto-generated for you by Hasura. You can have queries, mutations, and subscriptions automatically created for the data models that we created. For the product, we can insert a product. So we can call this mutation, which would be insert product 1, and GraphQL will guide us on the text that needs to be inserted. I'm just going to say speaker again, and I would want to give it a price, say 100, and be like an image path. I'm just going to give this JPG for now. Let's come back to that later. And the created at and updated at would have some default values. So that will continue to work. And we need to return back some data. So this would be some ID column that will get auto-generated on the backend. We've got this response from the backend, and this is insert product 1, ID 1. So we've inserted a new product with the ID 1. Let's add some more. Let's say mobiles, and let's do it 999. You know which mobile that would be. And go to data. Let's check the rows. We have the 2 rows here. So the mutation is working. Let's quickly do the query for the same, and then we'll move on to the integration for front. All right, so things are working fine. We can also make it a named query, fetch products, and we will make use of this query in our front end, in our Next.js app, and then see how we can do this templating. So instead of hard coding this ID and name, and maybe even I can even pass in the price. Instead of doing this, we would want to fetch this data from Hasura. So the thing here would be I can make any HTTP calls inside get static props. So I can make a fetch call, fetch API to any endpoint. In this case, this would be the GraphQL endpoint, and I'll send in a request body, and then it will give me back a JSON response in this format. So I'm not going to use any special client as of now. I'm going to make use of Fetch API to just showcase how you can, for a static app building part, we can still make use of just fetch API and then get away with it, right? So, right. We have a few comments. Kari, this tutorial, yeah, so I don't think I'll be talking about Auth0 this time around. I think the Learn course that we have on Hasura, that already has Auth0 instructions. So I think as part of this Next.js tutorial, we'll make use of Next.auth, and that would be part 2 of the stream. Hopefully that will be next week, next Wednesday. And do join us on that stream as well. That will have um, subscriptions, that will have auth, and with Next.auth, with a custom JWT server. So yeah, that's what Con also mentions. And right, so coming back to the fetch API call, since this is like an async function, I can do fetch response, do an await, fetch, and then I can pass in a GraphQL endpoint, right? And since GraphQL queries are a post request, I need to send in like a post uh, object as well. So I can maybe expand it over here or maybe create a new object, which would be options. And the method here would be post. And there would be, this would be JSON stringified. So inside this, we would want to pass the GraphQL query in a format. So in a typical REST API format, you would just send in some key value pairs that you know that the server will accept. In a GraphQL scenario, a simple fetch API, the only difference here is that you have format. You have to send in a query. You have to send in variables if there are any, and you have to send in the operation name, which will denote what the operation name for this looks like. The operation name is something similar to this. This is fetch products. This is the operation name for this particular GraphQL query. So we can send in something like that so that the backend can identify what request was made. So this is the anatomy of the query, and the query would itself be like a string, like a query string, and this will contain the actual GraphQL query. So this is what I'm going to copy. So you might be wondering, this is already a query, so why have another query over here? This could be also a mutation. Technically, you can do a mutation. You can also do like a subscription, but subscription, the API would be slightly different. So this could be like a query or a mutation. So the query over here is just like a notation for sending in the request body. And here the variables are empty for me. So I'm just going to remove this. It's an optional key. The operation name, I can send in fetch products. And yeah, so the fetch response would call this endpoint, and it will also pass in the options that we just created. Right. Next step would be to get fetch response JSON. It should be await fetch response.json. We can do a console.log of response.json, and let's go to the next app and then try refreshing it. We'll also look at the network tab for queries being made. All right, so this, in fact, I forgot to mention that this is a HTTP call that's being sent on the server side during build time. So the logs would appear over here instead of the browser. And you can see that the data product has like the objects coming in. I can, in fact, now start using this. So this would be products. This would be response JSON dot data dot products. This is the structure that the GraphQL server returned us. This would be data dot product, and this will be like an array of objects that you already have, which is of this format that we hard coded. Right. So this is data coming back from the server, and I'm going to remove this portion, which is hard coded. So instead of passing in the empty array, I'm just going to send in products. And hopefully in this console log, we'll see the product list from the server. I'll refresh this. And oops, we got an error. Right. We are sending in products, and this is, let's debug this. Let's the product, see what the value looks like. Product is undefined. We got product over here in the response. So this has to be products. And we're good to go. So I remember creating the table products, but I think it's a singular version. I keep switching between singular and plural naming, and the convention is that with Postgres or databases, you typically stick to uh, like a singular naming. It's my preference. Some people use plural naming, and so you can have like products, you can have users, you can have others. Uh, Mostly plural stuff. The problem with doing that is if you're fetching one data, or if you're fetching relational data for multiple stuff, the naming could get slightly confusing. Or maybe the schema will have some clashing with the names. So that's there. And also another naming convention issue that we typically have with GraphQL and Hasura. With JavaScript, you tend to use camel casing, and with databases, you use underscores for naming tables. So you will create aliases on top of those database tables to match your front-end code so that your front-end code looks neater. So that's another naming convention. Cool. All right. So now that I've fixed the typo in the naming, I should be able to fetch the data. And my console log gives me ID and name. So things are working fine. Data fetching is now working. Awesome. So let's actually, in fact, remove a bunch of these header and footer. So inside the main, maybe let's create our own map for products. I can do products.map. Let me remove, let me say welcome to Next.js and Hasura demo and create next app. This is the title, that's fine. Let's remove the other piece of code. So we till this one, I guess. Yeah. Right. So we have the heading, and then we're going to map over these products. I will create a UL. We're going to template a bunch of LIs into this. This would be products. And maybe I would not get the index from here. I got the ID from the DB, so you can use that as the key. So this would be product.id. And inside the LI, I would need the product.name. Let's see if this thing works. All right, I need to close the map. And I'm missing the final map. Awesome. So the semicolon is obviously unnecessary. And we have the speaker and mobiles data coming in. I would also probably want to display the price. So maybe do price and do like a dollar in front. Since we don't fetch the price, this doesn't come in. So now I'm just going to add this. It's as easy as that. And go back to Next.js app. And we can see the data coming in. Cool. So we've added a query and then we've templated our data into our HTML. Now, to verify that this is working as a static app, we can do page source, but obviously this is dev environment, so I have to probably do a build and then verify maybe. But I think I can already see the ULLI coming in here. So so that's it. So if you do a curl to your endpoint, you already see the HTML being pre-compiled for you, and then its output. So the static site generation portion is ready, right? And this is just purely using a fetch API call and nothing else, nothing fancy. You can obviously make as many queries inside this, do relational stuff, and then template it accordingly. You can call in other components and then pass in props into those. So that's all set up. But now, so where does Apollo client come in this kind of a scenario? You would want to replicate this query fetching logic on the client as well. So now what you've done is on the server side. Now you would want to also like create an Apollo client so that you can reuse one particular client, one configuration across your front-end components. So you might have like 10 different pages and 100 different components, and you want to like share data across multiple of those. With Apollo, you'll be able to configure like a cache, update cache from a different component so that data changes in a different component. So you can do all sorts of data updates and manipulation using a specialized client. So instead of going towards like a fetch API call, which would be like a naive implementation, which probably works for simple use cases. You can get away with just using this for a static blog. Maybe you don't need a client itself. You can just build using a fetch API client. But for a complex app like an e-commerce app, which involves some state and auth and so on, you are better off using Apollo client. Cool. So let's start the Apollo client integration. Um, I'm going to replace this code later with some Apollo client stuff. All right, so let's go to Apollo client server-side rendering. Obviously, you have to install the Apollo client module. So let me start off with that. Do yarn add Apollo client. This is version 3. Things have changed in version 3 for Apollo client. They've bundled everything into a single package. You can now import Apollo client, GraphQL, the cache modules, everything on the same bundle. Right. So now there are two approaches you can take with Apollo client setup with Next.js. You can use it for just like on the statics props portion, where instead of using this fetch API, you can just replace it with a client setup, which will have like a URL configuration with a GraphQL endpoint. And then the other approach is to set up a client with an Apollo provider HOC, which will pass in your client across all the components in your app.js, which would allow you to use the hooks that Apollo provides on your front end, on your client side. So you're having a component running which can use like a use query hook or a use mutation hook or use subscription hook. So that will allow you to make queries on the client side. Now, remember that this will not be pre-built data. This will not be HTML that is pre-compiled. This will be on the client side, dynamically fetching or doing some interactions. Obviously, in a complex app, you will have some dynamic interactions. In an e-commerce setup, you will have like an add to cart for a product. And then once you click on add to cart, you have to do some action on top of that. So for this kind of a dynamic interaction, you would need a GraphQL client to make the data fetching and cache updates seamless. And that's where the Apollo provider will be wrapped over your global component, and then you have access to your hooks everywhere. Right. So now instead of doing the Apollo client installation over here, I'm going to create like a new library, library directory at the top, and this would be here. Let's create a lib directory, and then I'm going to create a file called apollo.js. Right, so the configuration for creating an Apollo client, the setup, everything will be done over here. And then we'll do some imports in the right places in both index.js and whatever pages that we are using, GraphQL queries over, and we'll also set up Apollo provider over this component. Cool, so the first step is to import client. We have GQL, which may not be required in this particular file, but the next thing would be in-memory cache. And yeah, you can have create HTTP link. But I think let's first start with this and then add more as we require. This would be Apollo client. I'll also probably do HTTP link. Cool. So this is fine. So now we need a way to create the Apollo client. So let's expose a function which lets us do this. We can now return a new instance of Apollo client inside this, which would have the configuration. So we have the URI configuration, which would be our GraphQL endpoint. This would be our Next.js Hasura Cloud App URL. Now the URI is done. We might have some headers and so on. So this is typically what we'll have. We'll also have cache, which would be a new instance of in cache. So for the URI, so there are a couple of options. We can do a plain URI setup, or if you have headers and so on to configure, you can do a link, and this would be a new HTTP link instance. Inside of this is where you will have like a URI, and you can have headers and so on. It's fine. HTTP link is fine. Is the indentation. Right. So this is cache, and this is the link component for creating the HTTP link to make the query to the right endpoint. When we implement real-time GraphQL subscriptions, we will change this HTTP link to a WebSocket link. So we'll import WebSocket link from the subscriptions library and then change the endpoint from HTTPS to WebSockets. So that would be the change that might happen. But otherwise, this is fine. I think content type would be application JSON, which is fine, doesn't matter. But this is the configuration. So, all right, so now let's initialize like a variable where we can create this Apollo client and then assign it to this. Now, before that, we need a function to initialize Apollo client from inside of your component somewhere. So in your index.js, you might want to make use of Apollo client to make this query. So instead of this fetch call, we'll replace it with the Apollo call. Right. So looking at the comments, this binary64. Hi everyone. Hi binary64. If you can give us your name, that would be nice. Good resources for Hasura implementation for a SaaS. We do have a few sample apps on the open source repo, and that should like give you a good idea of what kind of apps you can build. You can literally build any type of apps, but like particular nuances around implementation of certain features with Hasura, that's like a good place to look at the sample apps repo. I'll just post the link on chat. The Hasura GraphQL engine. And then inside that, you have the community folder. This is all contributed by the community. So this is the sample apps directory. So let me post it on chat. Cool. Uma has another question. Pros and cons of Apollo versus SWR. Right. So I think the caching solution is different with both these libraries, and but fundamentally the data fetching um, is kind of similar in the API level. You can use hooks to do data fetching, but with SWR, it's basically stale while revalidate, and the fundamental concept is that you will make queries. You assume that the data uh, that you already have is correct, and then you render them, and then you make a revalidate by making another query, and then update the stale data with the new data. With Apollo client, you maintain like a cache, and like an in-memory cache or some kind of a caching solution. You can make GraphQL queries, and SWR is not specifically for GraphQL. It's in fact a solution which is independent of either GraphQL or REST API. So you can use like a REST API as well. So the implementation is up to you what you do with the API call. With Apollo, it's obviously catering to the GraphQL space. You have a schema and a type system GraphQL which lets you do better caching. But with SWR, you will be able to implement either REST APIs and then involve like a caching layer on top of that, or use GraphQL as well. So, in fact, I have a sample example with GraphQL and SWR. This is using the Hasura APIs and Next.js as well. So, um, just let me quickly show you the libraries over here. So I've written a wrapper over um, uh, for fetch, which will make a query to a GraphQL endpoint. This could be any GraphQL endpoint. I'm just using a localhost instance, and then passing in some headers and then returning some JSON data. This is for queries and mutations. And for subscriptions, I have created like a WebSocket, a native WebSocket client, just reusing that, and then exposing a function that I can import and then use it inside my components. So, for example, if I go to index, the queries are pretty simple. There's a use SWR hook that the library exposes, and then you just pass in the the arguments to make a query, and then the function to process that logic, right? So the function to process the logic would be to make a HTTP call. Now this could be either GraphQL or REST API and so on. So with Apollo, it's pretty native to GraphQL. So you use query Apollo hook. You pass in a GraphQL query over here, and then you get a response from the GraphQL server. So it's all GraphQL related, and the caching is handled differently with both these solutions. So that's fundamentally the difference. So I'm just going to post this as well on chat for a reference implementation. Right. So coming back to our Apollo client setup, let's let's do an yarn dev. Cool. Now let's wait for this to get over. All right, so now to make use of this Apollo client, we have to export like a function, which would be something called initialize Apollo, which will have like an initial state should be null to start with, but then the props will send in some data, some initial state, right? So then we'll have a shadow variable to check if this above instance of Apollo client, which we will create going forward. If this already exists, then let's reuse it. If not, create a new instance of Apollo client. Here we don't pass any arguments, we don't have any, but this could have like your authentication stuff, something around user specific stuff or so on. So you can send in some headers, specific headers for your application. But yeah, that's fundamentally what we're going to do. So we have like uh, an Apollo client uh, instance being created and then reused. Right. So then the next thing is to check if there is initial state already. And if there is initial state, then extract the cache out of it. So we would do a check to see if there is initial state that will come in. And if that is, then do existing cache and do like Apollo client dot extract. Right. So this is to just fetch the cache from the existing Apollo client instance. And then the next step would be to like restore the cache with existing data. So this would be Apollo client dot cache dot restore. And we have like a couple of things to spread. We have the existing cache and we have like the initial state as well. We're just restoring the cache with the current data set and then the initial state if there is any that's coming in from the props. Cool. So the other two sections would be to check if the mode is SSR, then always create a new version, new Apollo client instance. And yeah, so let's go to the with Apollo example to verify this. So it's the Apollo client. So if you're in like a server-side rendering mode, then you always create an Apollo client instance. You check the type of window. So if window exists, then you're on the client. If doesn't, then reuse the same Apollo client. If you're on the client side, recreate the Apollo client instance once more. So like once forever on the initial state. So that's what we're going to do here. Check if the type of window is there and return the Apollo client. Right. So this is for SSR. If type of window is defined, return Apollo client. The next step is to create client once on the front end. Right, so this would be to check if there is an instance of Apollo client already. If not, create a new client instance, right? So this would be Apollo client and just to Apollo client is equal to underscore Apollo client. So this is the variable that we declared above. So we're just assigning the newly created Apollo client instance over here, and then assigning it to this variable that we can reuse. Cool. So that's mostly what we're doing here. We're initializing a few things. We're setting the cache setup right, and then finally we're returning Apollo client. So this is the export of the initialize Apollo function, which we'll use inside index.js. Right. So finally, I'm just going to uh, reuse the use Apollo. There's another use Apollo function that we'll export, which will have the page props coming in from the Next.js component. And then we'll make use of use memo to reduce the number of calculations that are being made. So if there is like a specific set of queries with the same set of variables or same set of data being queried, this would be pretty useful. The performance of your query would be faster because this will come in from like a cache uh, once you're using use memo, right? So that's where we're returning this. Just going to look at the comments to see if there are any. Right, there aren't any comments. Awesome. So I'm just gonna return the store. So this is use memo, initialize Apollo with some state. So here for us, the state would be the initial state that we have. So that would be what we will be sending in. So let's export this function. Use Apollo. This will accept the initial state argument. And then we have like a store, which will make use of the use memo hook. So we'll need to import the use memo from React. This is use memo. This is Apollo. And this would have, this will not take in any argument, but then we'll need to return initialize Apollo with the initial state followed by the initial state. Right, so we've exported the initialize Apollo method. Now we can head to index and then replace some code over here with the initialize code. So I'm going to remove this portion. In fact, let's just comment this out and then write our sections of the Apollo. For now, I'm going to return an empty array and we'll change once we have the data coming back from Apollo. This would be empty just to verify that app is running. Cool. So now we'll need to make use of initialize Apollo. So we'll create a client. And then once we call the initialize Apollo method, this would create a new Apollo client instance with the above configuration with the HTTP link of this GraphQL endpoint. And then it will, depending on the cache, depending on the existing state and the cache, it will merge some data. SSR mode is handled, and one instance of client is created on the front. This will all happen once we do that. So this would be client. This would be initialize Apollo. And to do this, we need to import the library that we created. So this would be initialize Apollo from, this would be a directory er inside pages. So this would be lib and Apollo. Cool. So now that we've initialized Apollo client, so this will have a client for us. Let's in fact do a console and then verify it. All right, so we need to install GraphQL module along with Apollo client. I think that module, so I'm just adding that. Let's do yarn dev now. Awesome. So let me refresh it now. Cool. So the client is available over here. We can see the options for the link, the cache options, and the data, and the version as well. So everything is ready. The client is ready for access inside the get static props method. So we'll do like a client.query to make a call for fetching data. So we do data. We'll do like an await client.query. Should be accepting an argument called query. It's very similar to what we did over here. We're just passing in query. And here we'll need to pass in the similar one. So I'm just going to copy this. Ideally, this should be like a query file that we write and then export. So this is query, and we need to pass in the GQL string. So this would be import GQL from Apollo clients. Right, so here it's just a raw string that our server understands. Here for Apollo client, we need to send in GQL so that the query can be parsed as a proper GraphQL string, and more fancy things can be done on top of this particular query. So the client or the server both can actually break down this into nodes and fields, and then you have the relevant types associated with it as well. So that's possible with that. And I'm going to close this query. I think that's what we've done here. So this is done. Let's do data. See if data is coming in. We can remove the console.log for clients and then do a refresh. And the product data is coming in. So we have product ID 1, name speaker, price 100, whatever. So this data is coming in, and here we're using Apollo client for this. Now we'll return this. So if we look at the data structure, this is product. We already have data over here. So this would be data, which would be like data dot product, which would be like an array of objects. So we'll send in data dot product, and then ideally we should see this template working, the map that we wrote over the top, and the LIs are being rendered. Awesome. So what we've done is we've started off with the fetch API, then we've replaced it with Apollo client so that we can now reuse this Apollo client in multiple places. Right. So to do that, we will need to import Apollo provider. We do Apollo provider from Apollo client. Let me look at comment. All right. Cool. So we will need to like create a client, and then we can pass in Apollo client. So going to do use Apollo. This would also come in from lib Apollo that we created. This is from apollo.js. This would be use Apollo, the one which accepts the initial state and then returns the store. So this would be store as well. And then this would return, this would call the initialize Apollo function with the initial state. Right, so let's go to app, and here this would be client, use Apollo, and we will have initial props from Apollo. This would be initial Apollo props, I suppose. And the return would be the Apollo provider wrapped around the component. This would be Apollo provider, and we'll pass in the client. And inside that, we'll have the components followed by the page props. Right, so let's see if this is rendering the app, working fine. Yeah, things are working fine. Now, what this allows us to do is we can make use of client-side queries with hooks. We have GQL imported. Now, to make queries on the client side, we have to use the use query hook. This would be use query being imported from Apollo client. The difference here is that on the static side, props function, we use the client that we initialized initially, and then made like a client.query, and then this is going to give us data. But this is all build time, and this cannot be used on the client. The client, you will typically want to use a hook like a use query or a mutation, which would be use mutation like this. And similarly for subscription, you would import use subscription and call the right constants. So here I'm going to make use of this use query. I'm going to do loading data, loading error data, the triplet to make the query. This will be use query. And let's create another table on Hasura. I'm going to fetch a list of users. So this would be users. For now, let's say ID, name, and create a dot. Awesome. So what we're going to do is on the client side, we will fetch users. On the build time, we've already fetched products and it's already templated. On the client side, we will fetch users. So this would be fetch users. Now let's type this query over here. Fetch users, GQL, paste the query. And so this is done. This is fetch users. Let's import it over here. We don't have any variables. Typically, if there are any, then we'll pass in like an options for the hook. Right, so now, depending on what the state of the query is, so let's in fact do data first and then see if data is coming in from the DB. Let's also add a couple of users. I'm going to look out for some users on the chat. Let's add everyone who's on the comments. Scon, Scalas, and there's three. Cool. So we have 3 rows. This is all fine. This should give us 3 rows. Awesome. So this data should come in now ideally on the front end. So let's refresh this. And on the front end, we see users with the list of users with the objects ID, name, ID, name, ID, name, right? So what we've done here is this data is being fetched from the server at build time. This user's data is queried on the client side on the runtime on the client side. So we can now make use of this. So we can also do like a loading state as well. So what we can do is for a particular section of the UI, we can do like a loading state. If there is loading, then return loading. If not, just ignore. And if there is an error, return an error. If not, ignore again. And if there is data.users, which is what we want, which is what we want to map on, and this would be data.users.map. In fact, we need to also verify if data exists before mapping over them. So this would be user. And let's see, let's return divs maybe. This would be user dot name, and we can give a key, which should be user dot id. Right, so this is map closed. This is fine. And if not, we need to return null. Awesome. So we have the 3 users coming in. We have the products data as well. And if we do a build, we can do np yarn build. Look at some comments. Right. So once we have the build, we can verify that one portion of the query is fetching data on the client, which is the users, but the product data is already prefetched on the build time on the server, and that would be your simple Jamstack app. Right, let me refresh 3000. If you notice, there was a loading div for a second, and then once the data comes in, you see the users coming in, but the speaker and mobiles data, the list of products have been pre-built. This can again be verified using a curl or a page source. So this data is being pre-compiled on build time, and then you're getting the HTML back pretty easily. But there is no reference of the user's data because it's dynamically fetched on the client. So we have these 3 users coming in on the client side. The request is also made on the front end. So there is this GraphQL post request. which is made, and then there's a list of users being fetched. Awesome. So we have basically demonstrated how to do statics props and then build like static apps, and then also add dynamic data fetching on the client. So with the import of a use query, or let's say a use mutation, we can now do dynamic stuff, dynamic data fetching or manipulation on the client side. So if you have like an input box or a button which needs interaction, and on interaction you want to do some data manipulation on the backend, you can, like for example, if you have a button, let's say you have button over here, and if you have like an unsubmit handler, you can actually call the use mutation hook over here, right? So that's what we would typically do. And this is a good use case for a Jamstack app, because fundamentally your product data, which is more or less not going to change too much, unless maybe the price, which might change, but you can take a rebuild for that. But bunch of this data is going to be precompiled, so you can make use of get static props. Uh, some of the dynamic portions of your app, like let's say a user who's logged in, and then that data might change, and then it's dynamically uh, fetched on the front end, right? So this data will be dynamically fetched on the client using these Apollo client hooks. And the use case for Apollo client is, I mean, you might be wondering, you can also maybe use like a fetch API call over here, but then you will lose out the benefit of caching. So this data now would be available in your, the user data will be available in your cache. And let's say you're having a different component which accesses data or access this product data, you would be able to like either access that data or change that data, and then the UI gets updated automatically across different components. So that kind of fancy magic that you want to do with state will be taken care by Apollo client, and even Urkel does that. So that's where a specialized graphical client will be useful in comparison to using a raw fetch client. But in case you're using just a pure Jamstack site for like building a blog or building uh, just like a pure static site with no interactions and no sign up or auth, then you don't need a GraphQL client. You just need a simple fetch wrapper, return somewhere, and then import that wrapper, and then call your GraphQL endpoint, and then make the GraphQL queries. And you can like remove, add fields as your data changes. So that's your typical use case for building like a Jamstack app with Next.js. And GraphQL adds in value with the schema and type system. So if you're adding TypeScript, the code can be auto-generated for your queries, and there is GraphQL code generator for you, which auto-generates types. And yeah, because of the schema and type system, the caching will be pretty easy to maintain. So that is caching on the client side. We also have caching on the backend. So for that, I'll quickly just upgrade my project and then show you caching. Yeah, this might take a while, but then what you can do with caching with Hasura is that you can do cache directive, which will allow you to cache a particular query, the response of the query. And if you make this query with this directive on your front end, so this would look like something like this. Cached, you can also pass in like a time to expire, the time TTL, which would be in seconds. up to a maximum of 300 seconds. You can have it for 5 minutes. Once you specify this directive, you will be able to cache the response of this query, and the response and the data fetching will be very fast. Even if you are making a hit to Hasura, the data fetching will be very fast. Now, in that case, you probably don't need like the Apollo's client solution for an extent, because you can still make a HTTP API call with this directive, and then even though it hits Hasura endpoint, because it's cached data, you get back the response pretty quickly, right? So that's one of the caching mechanism on the backend. But again, on the front end, you need a cache to update UI components, which are distributed across different areas of your app. So there are benefits to both the client-side cache and the server-side cache. Different use cases for different needs, but that's what you can do with caching. So I've actually made this query over here. I've also changed the cache directive. Let's look at that on the front end. Let's look at the GraphQL query that's being made. We will probably have like a cache header if that was enabled on the response headers. Might have to wait for a while, I guess. Yeah, I think the project might take a while to enable caching. Cool. So that's mostly it for today's stream. Next week we'll talk about how to integrate Auth with Hasura and Next.js. We'll make use of the next Auth module. I'm quite excited to try this out and then add a sample app as an integration with Hasura. And then we'll also make use of API routes in Next.js and integrate it with Hasura's event triggers, or maybe even we can use it as an action. We'll deploy it on Vercel and see how a full Jamstack app can be built with these two frameworks. We'll make use of the backend custom logic for the backend with Next.js API routes. And then we can also make use of events, database events. So for example, we have this user. Let's say that after logging in, you want the user to receive an email. We can make use of database events and then call like a serverless endpoint, maybe, or any HTTP endpoint for that matter. And Next.js API routes will be like a perfect place to host that custom logic and then call it from Hasura end. So that's if you're building your app in Next.js, there'll be a perfect place to put a custom logic in API routes and then call through triggers. You can also like define actions for your custom logic. So you'll define your custom types for query and mutation, and then point a handler. This handler can be your API route in Next.js, which will be available once deployed on Vercel. So that's what we're going to look at next week, next Wednesday. So do join us on that stream as well. I'll drop in more links for this. Meanwhile, I'll also send you a more sophisticated course that we have for the Next.js one. So I'll actually go to learn. This would be Next.js plus Apollo. Just gonna drop links. This has like a full stack introduction to Next.js and Apollo and using serverless functions with Hasura. Right, so there you go, links in chat. we've seen just the query bit for today, but we've seen both client side and static side fetching of that. Uh, Mutations will be very similar. You will have like a use mutation hook that you can call in. But then next week, instead of auth0, we'll look at a custom JWT solution with Next.auth, and then see how you can integrate auth into this kind of an app, and then make your Jamstack app completely dynamic, where we'll fetch in products at build time, but then user data and dynamic interactions happen on the client with authenticated requests. Awesome. So that's it for today. Thanks for joining in. Stay tuned to our January campaign videos. We still have more content to come in. Yesterday we had Adrian's Go series with the Go stack and GraphQL. And next week we'll have this continuation of Next.js. And the week after that we'll have Gatsby as well. So we'll do Gatsby plus Hasura and see how you can use GraphQL layer of Gatsby with Hasura, and the same static app building and the dynamic interactions bit with Gatsby and how it's different from Next.js. That will be interesting to try out as well. Awesome. So yeah, that's it for today. Thanks for joining in. See you next week. Bye bye.